Welcome back to Conversations from the Collection. I'm Zana Kobayashi, and in honour of International Day of People with a Disability, we are delighted to bring you a special bonus episode with artist Fayen that was recorded earlier this year live at the Newcastle Writers Festival. Fayen is an artist who draws on blindness to propose critical and imaginative methods for navigating uncertainty. And in this episode, you'll hear Fayen in dialogue with Newcastle Art Gallery Curatorial lead Peter Johnson, engaging in a conversational strategy Fayen terms blundering, an experiment that will take you across vast and varied topics, including how we might begin to decentre sight within the arts, how we might begin to understand alien languages, and even touching on the impact of nuclear power on deep time. Throughout the talk, you'll hear Fayen referring to some images on screen. Although I personally feel the rich stories she tells around them are descriptions enough, we have included a link to them in the show notes if your curiosity gets the better of you. Before we get started, I'm really excited to let you know that we have begun production for our new season of Conversations from the Collection. We'll be bringing you 6 new episodes jam-packed with incredible artists and their stories. Find it weekly in your podcast feed from January 10. But for now, please enjoy your blunder with Fayen and Peter Johnson live at the Newcastle Writers Festival.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming. This is going to be a really exciting conversation this afternoon, and I'm really excited to talk to Fayen. My name is Peter Johnson, and I am the still pretty fresh curatorial lead.
Well, still pretty.
At the Newcastle Art Gallery. Of course, I'd like to start by acknowledging that we work and play and live on the lands of the Awabakal and the Warramai people, the lands and waters, and particularly in this context about storytelling and about writing, acknowledging that there are stories written into this land since time immemorial. Pay respects to any First Nations people here, to the elders of this place, and to the elders yet to come. I'll give you a quick introduction, and then Fayen is going to give us a way forward in this conversation, perhaps an experimental performance way forward that I am not at all terrified about, but we're going to find a way through. So Fayen is an artist and writer born in Malaysia, but raised in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and now living in the bushlands of unceded Jarrah country, Australia, in regional Victoria. Fayen's projects are often collaborative and resist spectatorship by inviting audiences into sensorial readings of artworks. She is also the founder of independent imprint 3ply, which approaches artist-led publishing as an experimental site for the creation, dispersal and archiving of texts. Over to you.
Thanks, Peter. First of all, thank you all for being here today. It's quite stunning and remarkable to me that there's such a wonderful audience crowd, potentially invited participants in this discussion. Peter sent these lovely questions to me the other day about what we might talk about, and I thought they're great, they're well researched, but is that the most exciting thing to do, was in my head. And then this morning I was browsing the Newcastle Art Gallery Instagram, and I happened to notice that the post about our talk that got the most likes was one where it related to blindness and uncertainty. And there was one comment on there, and it was something about, uncertainty being so important to consider, but it was told, I think, through emojis or something. But it was that idea. And so it struck me that this was a wonderful moment to propose to Peter that we not go with a series of prepared questions at all, but instead that this could become a blundering performance. And I thought this was relevant also to acknowledge and thank the Newcastle Writers Festival for partnering with the Newcastle Art Gallery to invite me here. I normally live and work from Jarrah country, which is about an hour and a half north of Naarm, Melbourne, but I've come here for this occasion. And so there are many aspects of my practice that we'll go into, no doubt, that relate to writing and publishing in all sorts of ways. The one that's really, I think, very related to writing is the notion of blundering. So around about, I don't know, let's say 7 or 8 years ago, I'd been low vision all my life, but I had a sudden degeneration in my vision. And I started to really question, well, I'm making paintings and I'm writing and I'm publishing books. What's that going to mean as I approach blindness? And after a period of, being kind of rattled by this, I started to delve into blindness a lot more. And one of the things that I read about a lot and listened to friends who are blind a lot was about how blindness in rhetorical speech has become synonymous with ignorance. So you'll often find, and you may even do this without thinking in your speech or in your writing, somebody's blind to something, somebody's blind drunk. So perpetually, even though other terms, people now have questioned again, those of us who experience various forms of blindness, we strike this all the time, that we are synonymous with ignorance. And it struck me that one of the ways that I could begin to reclaim this was by looking at the etymology of blindness and looking at the etymology of blundering, because to blunder is to stumble blindly. And I thought, well, actually, that's really interesting to me. So I started out firstly as a performance in a gallery, just getting up, taking my glasses off so I didn't have any useful vision, and with my cane blundering around a gallery space. And what I discovered was that it was really interesting in a performance sense, because the cane tapping gave a sense of the direction of my movement. It also, you could read the gallery spaces and the sculptures that were in there because of the reverberations around the room. And then I thought, well, you can actually use this in a writing way, because those of us, who do a little bit of writing, the hardest moment can be when you've got this empty page or, empty Word doc or whatever on your computer. Like, how do you actually begin? How do you get started? And so I started to experiment with blundering as a method of writing, and a method of writing where you just begin and you set out, but it's not like you're ignorant at all. You have your wayfinding methods. I also started to pay attention to stopping and holding certain words, leaning further into etymology, thinking about the textures of words. And so, this notion of blundering came about. I've also used it in lectures, which is the worst situation to try it in, because you're basically turning up with zero preparation and just trusting that this is going to be interesting in some way. And so I've never done this before with a partner in crime, and so I'm really excited that this is the first occasion in which we have agreed to blunder together through this hour-long talk. Sorry, and abandon all of Peter's well-prepared questions. So, how's that sound, Peter?
It sounds fabulous, and I would like to extend the blundering invitation to everyone in the audience as well. So, we'll perhaps have a bit of a nothing is formal about this at this point, but a formal Q&A at the end. But if you've got burning questions, much better to have this as a discussion and a conversation. I guess in terms of what I thought was interesting, you were talking about blundering is about, decentering the ocular, decentering sight. And this is something that I've really been thinking about in terms of not a disability or access framework, but in terms of a queer curatorial methodology, and then tracing that, the tyranny or the supremacy of the ocular, really from the Enlightenment onwards, right? That from the observable universe, the observable facts, from experimentation, things that could be mathematics being rendered as graphs and things that you can see. To see is to understand. All the way through to John Berger ways of seeing, where he makes that salient point that to see someone is to also have the knowledge that you are seen, and that in that sort of seeing economy, you have power over each other, or there's sort of a sight economy at play. But really, what's interesting, I think, about a lot of the work you do is pushing back on, and it's interesting in the visual arts, right? Like it's in the title, visual arts, but pushing back on the ocular and the visual as the primary or the most important way of making meaning or recording meaning. We were also talking about, particularly in First Nations and other cultures, that so much more meaning is held in movement and dance and bodies over periods of time, that, you know, the way that we communicate and make knowledge isn't just through having seen something, it might be through having smelt something or touched something. I don't know, that's my blunder to you.
Yes, so this is when you're learning cane navigation at the beginning, you know, you learn to take a step and sort of sweep the field and figure out obstacles in the path and then choose to take another step. So that's sort of, right, we've swept the field, this is where we're at. Let's just think about this for a minute. I think there's all sorts of ways that you can come to this. I mean, you can, as you've already said, you know, just now, you can come to this from queerness, you can come to this from indigeneity, you can come to us from other cultural traditions, you can come to this from various experiences like, you know, I'm a mother, you know, through motherhood and other ways that you suddenly go, hang on, why are all of these systems relied on these kind of visual methods of documentation and knowing? Because there's so much more in an embodied sense that we learn and we know and we find out. And certainly from disability practice, there are so many different ways of apprehending the world or navigating the world, and they're just sort of cast aside. And I think one of the great ways to demonstrate this is in terms of the documentation of performance and sound works. Because it's always amusing to me when you're reading these articles about these performance works or sound works, and there's like, you know, an image of one moment or one sort of empty gallery with some speakers in it. Like, what is that really conveying about the experience? And so one of the things that I've loved is that over these past probably about 6 to 8 years that I've had the privilege of being able to recognise that I can offer a perspective, you know, through this altered vision. I've come into contact with all sorts of people who are coming to the same kind of point. One of my collaborators, very close collaborator, is Benjamin Hancock, who's coming to our collaboration from not only being an extraordinary dancer, but also a drag artist and very known as a performer within the drag scene. And so the ways that Benjamin plays with masculinity and femininity and troubling that space is actually a place that we can come together and talk as well. So we're all finding different ways that you can puncture this supremacy of vision that has been really reducing the experiences and the ways that we have of recounting our histories or perceiving into the future.
It was interesting talking earlier today about your work with Benjamin in particular. I remember very clearly seeing his performance around your work at the National, at the Art Gallery of New South Wales in 2019.
More or less.
And it being incredibly beautiful, but also, like at the time, quite inscrutable to me. But then to hear you...
Oh, look, behind us, for those who are listening, we have a PowerPoint of images that I threw together on the train, and it just so happened that Benjamin has appeared and he's performing in the radial corridor of a historic prison that's associated with sensory deprivation, and he's performing amidst a cloud of skeletal bells that's created by a blind sculptor that I work with, Aaron McPeak, who's based in London.
Yes, sorry, but what you were saying earlier today in terms of actually you're having worked with him, every movement, there's a totally different legibility to the way in which he moves.
Oh yes, I'm actually always surprised that other people say that it's inscrutable, because I'm like, well, didn't you see that tail of the E wrapped around him? So actually the performances may seem like that, but you know, if you were to spend a little time with me beforehand and go, okay, well, no, the ways that we've translated this particular typeface, firstly, we decide, is it a serif or a sans serif? Is it caps? Is it lowercase? What are the features of this typeface? We really go quite deep into that. But then he embodies it, so it's not just a sort of YMCA movement, although some of them actually, you know, are the creation of the letter form within his body. But some of them he's like I remember early on talked about, well, what I want to do is slide down the leg of this K, because this K is very distinctive in its form, and so within the performance, that's what he does. There are always some shapes within the performances that actually are honouring the roots of the performance. So there are some shapes that are not letter forms, but he creates those bells with his body. So there's these moments where he does this incredible articulation of his spine, pulling himself up off the floor, and that's because every time that we have this performance, we honour Aaron McPeak and the bells. So it's a form of like a resonance call back through time to the beginnings of the performance, even as we enact a new version. But yes, if I was to show you the typefaces and how we've translated them, probably it'd be like one of those magic pictures where you see the image and suddenly it's like, oh, absolutely, that's what that says. Yeah.
I guess I'm also really interested in that series of works that you did, creating that. I think we have a show and tell image here, but creating, working with Auslan to develop, I guess, ways of talking about work or ways of talking about sort of academic rigour or engagement, and then creating sort of a glyphic language to record that.
I mean, this came from a whole series of works where I think about how we might publish over deep time, like how we can think about publishing beyond the demise of humanity's collapse, which is a little bit bleak. But, I was thinking about, this ecological chaos. I was thinking about COVID, and I started my professional career as a climate change researcher. I was thinking about the change over that time. But I was also thinking, really, to be, that I'm upfront about this, that it's also a way of challenging the contemporary moment, because one of the things that I do is I think about, well, how would we communicate to either aliens or, future humans? Because there is, within that kind of world, people often say, well, the most likely aliens to encounter Earth would be humans who got into a spaceship and went far enough away and over many, many years forgot about Earth and came back. So that's a discussion that happens within these kinds of astrophysical conversations. And so I thought, well, how would you leave our stories? And also I thought about, well, what stories would you tell? Because I don't have to tell the stories that are many of the ones that I've received. So do you present the complicated history of this is the history, but actually it's not my history? Or actually, can I just present my own stories? And so that's when I started to think about, well, what would I carve into rock? Because that's one of the ways that we know works over deep time. And also thinking about oral and embodied storytelling. If like remnants of society existed and I was to teach generation after generation that would, carry the story down, what would be the stories that I would tell through embodied movement? Now, one of the things I also thought about was, well, I work with a lot of deaf performers, and I happen to love American Sign Language poetry and Auslan poetry, and I'm really intrigued, and I just love the expressiveness of it. And I thought, well, how could you communicate like an Auslan or American Sign Language poetic poetry over deep time? And that's when I thought, well, there's a problem with all of these typefaces because they're so, they're written and read in these certain ways. So then I worked with Anna Seymour to translate certain poetic phrases into gesture that's based in Auslan. And then I worked with a typographer, Vincent Chan, to turn it into typographic glyphs. And now these exist on my computer, and they're attached to certain words. So if I write touch, I can write it just in a font that's on Word or whatever. If I choose my font, it changes it into the glyph. So it will recognise word by word. So over time, building up a bank of signs that can be used. And the advantage of doing that digitally is that ultimately I'm hoping to get to a form that I'm happy with that I could then carve into granite. So I could then go around and, if people would like to invite me to carve into their rocks, here's some test examples of various granite forms that I've carved. I would be able to communicate these. So I made some screen print versions. Now they were double-layered screen prints. And so the back layer are botanicals from Jarrah country that I collected with my son and his sister, and as a way of acknowledging Jarrah within the images rather than just the glyphs on a white page. And so I've printed them, the two layers, with Vision Australia with a tactile print. And so I haven't bought the original screen prints, but I have brought the tactile prints today because they're very COVID safe. They can be easily cleaned between showings. And I thought I would show this one here. I'll show you how to read it because it's like Benjamin's forms. I think as soon as you know how to read it, you can actually read it and perform it. Let's see, how are we going? Look, we're balancing 3 things here. This is so precarious. Okay, so this one is we. This is get in touch with things at the point they break down. So we get in touch with things at the point they break down. So I'll pass these around so that it might be interesting, those glyphs, but also, you know, the tactility of the screen print image and the dots. Oh, look at that.
I have a total random ramble, and then I might swing back around to ekphrasis. But thinking about sort of deep time communication, do you know those sort of speculative architecture, you probably do, around warning sort of deep time future humans about nuclear waste sites or post-nuclear?
Yes. Yes, of course.
Yeah.
This is one of the common topics. So what's your ramble?
Oh no, the ramble, I just think it's fascinating. And if you have a chance to Google, or we can put the link in the show notes for the podcast, these are amazing sort of speculative architecture buildings to denote to, I guess, some sort of Mad Max future, where how would you denote that this land is irreparably contaminated for basically the rest of time, and these, some of them are just like these enormous sort of spikes that come out of the ground, and others are like these bizarre fortresses, and but just interesting. I guess that's mostly how I'd thought about deep time communication, or maybe like the Voyager 2 golden record, but really interesting to think about it in the terms that you are.
But I mean, both of those, I mean, Voyager, for one, you know, these, pointing to nuclear radiation sites, they are really key conversations within the, messaging and search for extraterrestrial intelligence communities, because it really is difficult. Do you bring attention to that key site? Because by putting that building there, you're drawing the attention of these alien forms or future human forms to a place that might, irreparably endanger them if it's the nuclear half-lives and if it's still actually radioactive. And I think one of the reasons why I'm very aware of these conversations is because I was lucky enough to be invited by Jen Bervin, who's an incredible poet artist, a good friend of mine in the States, and she invited me. She was an artist in residence at the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and she invited me to join her residency to create a series of works. And so we spent time together at the Lassen Crater Array in Northern California, which is where they have the small-scale telescopes. So they're the different offering to the giant scopes. That's sort of the very big dishes, and these are smaller ones. And they're a more mobile array that can be pointed to different constellations where they have, for some reason or another, thought that there might be alien signalling. And so it was fascinating to be there because we were there with Jill Tarter, who's a retired astrophysicist who was very involved with SETI. Jill is the character that Jodie Foster was based on from Contact. And so she knew everything about that history of alien communication, the key debates, why they're important, why they're both have a silliness to them, but a real fundamental gravity to them as well. And also, one of the things that I really realised when I was talking to her is that SETI is as much about us right now. So in other words, you can go off and you can talk about messaging to another form as a way of thinking about how do we communicate with each other, and they're very aware of that. For example, there's a lot of work going on with the communication of whales and dolphins, and this sort of the bubble rings that they manage to form. And so there's a lot of scientific discovery about us as humans and our relationship to species here that is provoked by thinking about extraterrestrial communication. And so that was one key moment when I realised that you can use this as a device to talk about disability justice in the present moment. Because as soon as you're talking about alien forms that we've got no idea what the embodiment would be, instantly the notion of having readers of your material, publishing to this audience is very different, because how are they going to engage with it? We don't know. And so it instantly expands the sensory access points that you can utilise when you're thinking about publishing.
I mean, literal universal design or galactic design.
Yes. Well, funny that you should say that, because another person within the blind community that I really respect and have been in recent communication with is Sherry Beth Wells Jensen, who is a xenolinguist. So she's a specialist in alien languages, and she's on the board of the Messaging for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And she's also an Astro Access astronaut. She says it's not an astronaut because they're going to the edge of space, so they go to 0G, but they're not going further at the moment. But she works on accessible space design, so thinking truly about universal space design. And Sherry is blind, and there's quite a history of astrophysicists, xenolinguists and others who are blind who have been involved at key moments within that community.
Amazing. Where I was going to circle back around to was some of the conversations that we've been having around ekphrasis, or that sort of really long practice of using words to describe images, often also in a way that captures the spirit of the work or captures the emotional reality of the work. And then I'm particularly interested in the research and the history that you found around Diderot and the way that that starting of that way of describing work as well.
Yeah, so this I have to always acknowledge my friend and collaborator Georgina Cleage, who's recently retired from Berkeley as a professor of literature, is currently a visiting fellow at NYU. Georgina's a leading scholar internationally on blindness and art. She's written a number of books, including More Than Meets the Eye. She's written about my work as part of some of her writings. And we've collaborated now for a number of years after I just sort of rocked up and told her, look, these are some issues that I'm having with people not touching paintings that I want to make, and sort of going on and on about the sorts of things I'm interested in. And she was sort of willing and game to show up and be part of some experiments with me at Caddis Foundation in San Francisco. So there is really a history of people being incredibly generous in terms of offering themselves or their collections or so on, and I always try and acknowledge that. So we were sitting there in San Francisco in this meeting where we were trying to think about how could audio description be more interesting? What is it doing well and what is it not doing well, and where could it be exciting? And we did things like, Christine Sun Kim, who's a wonderful deaf artist, had a series of drawings. Well, how would you communicate the complexity of those drawings, to a blind audience? And we ended up doing something performative with kind of clicking and fingers and so on. Anyway, at the beginning of this meeting, Georgina started talking about an essay that she wrote, which looked at this friendship and history between Denis Diderot and Mélanie de Salignac, who was a young French blind woman. He's often spoken about as one of the founders of art criticism because he produced a series of writings on the Paris salons where he went painting by painting and described these different works, and he took all sorts of experimental liberties in the ways that he described them. Sometimes he started in one corner and gradually described all the way up to the other corner. Sometimes he made up fictional dialogues. Sometimes he sort of wrote in his personal feelings about this and spoke directly to the painter whose work he didn't like and explained why he didn't like them or their work. He did all sorts of wonderful things. Sometimes he described them through dreams, and he published these in the Correspondance Littéraire, which was a serial publication that Baron von Grimm edited. And I love that he would start it off and he'll say to Baron von Grimm in these letters, I'll describe to you, and with a little bit of imagination, it will be as if you're there. And but one of the things that Georgina pointed to was that at the same time that he was coming up with those descriptions that we often hear about in, when you're learning about art history at university or something, nobody had ever mentioned to me that at the same time he had a friendship with Mélanie de Salignac. And Georgina's speculation was that his conversations with Mélanie de Salignac may have influenced the ways he approached the descriptions of these. Because if you think about it, the description, art criticism, the description of going to a show and what you thought about the show is kind of like audio description. You're describing for an audience who can't see, who aren't there. And so he had these series of conversations with Mélanie. So if I described it like this, how would you interpret it? How would I describe this to you? And she was very sassy and kind of talked back to him about things. And then after Georgina mentioned this, I was reading his salon writings, and I realised that there's an appendix called Notes on Painting, and it starts out with a description of a blind woman that exactly matches the physiology of Melanie de Salignac. So I think it's beyond speculation. My firm belief now is that the foundations of art criticism can be mapped back to conversations between two intelligent people, one blind and one sighted.
How does that inform the way in which you approach either audio description or I guess just best practice for creating universal or alternative or different ways for people to approach works? Because I guess I'm thinking about the exhibition that you were talking about recently, where there were works that people were encouraged to, invited to touch, and no one did, right? Because we've created these. I mean, I'm unapologetically here for a big art institution, temple to culture, but we've also created these spaces where it's you don't touch, and that's a mixture of capitalist value. It's a mixture of very real conservation concerns, boss. It's a mixture of all of these sort of complicated forces. But how do we create a more interesting, better, fleshed out experience of art?
Well, I think one of the things that's really great is that, that was my first show where I publicly engaged with what I was, thinking through in terms of blindness, the one that you're mentioning. And it was a show, there's an image that'll come up at some point where there's a kind of a plywood architecture, and there's tactile paintings on there. And I wrote 2 stories that I forced Peter to listen to part of one of them the other day, about 10 years ago. And I'm not saying it's great writing, but I still love the ideas that are in them. And it was because I performed them with 2 actors from the Theatre of the Blind, and they were both about the assumptions of visual value that exist in society. Anything from art fairs to the reflections on glass and windows and chrome shiny sculptures. What is it that you're really seeing? Botox, parts of plastic surgery that's based on this visual value, celebrity lookalikes. I was trying to think about all these things that are kind of within culture that become problematized if you're coming from blindness. And as I say, it was the fact that I made these white-on-white works that I thought would look gorgeous when they were all grubby after a month of people touching them, and they just look pristine at the end. And so I thought, well, either they're way more robust than I thought, or something's going on here. And it's actually been the path from there through to now that allowed me to understand what do you do in order to kind of mix it up. And that we get in touch with things at the point they break down was the first part of the title of a show that I had during COVID in Melbourne. And then the last part of that title was Even in the Absence of Audiences and Spectators, Dust Scatters. And the path that it's taken me from that first show to now is that I've realised that you can reconsider exhibition making as a dust cloud of sensorial improvisations, translations and conversations. And then it becomes about this interesting process of activating people to engage more than the visual. So there are things like being willing to pass around things that are tactile that might provoke somebody to go, I'm remembering these senses. What does it feel like to feel, an oblong of Jurassic marble where the dust is coming off of my hands? I mean, especially when you know that that's the bones of Jurassic creatures that is actually coming with you. So there's something that you take away and something that you give back to this process. It's even about, moments where I'll introduce within a gallery space. There's some images where especially my son has been really fantastic. Children are fantastic about disrupting the not touching. So I've actually elevated them at times to be my assistants or my, co-guides or something, and invited them to read out sensory scores. I often invite different collaborators to offer sensory scores. There's a whole series of scores I actually have online, everything from a great blind artist in the States, Jennifer Justice, wrote one called Trip the Light Ekphrastic, which is about how do you even approach describing a painting if you're not sure about it. And it's funny and it's great and it's wonderful. And Georgina wrote a beautiful one about a bronze cast that Sophie Takash had made of the interior space between Georgina and my clasped hands. It's a really tactile object. And when I hold it, it is, again, like I'm holding Georgina's hand. But I think you want to focus your thoughts around access to the temporary, collectively held community that you have at any moment, and continually expanding the intimacy of that access and the levels of invitation.
It reminds me of my also just the different ways that people feel compelled to or want to engage with artworks. One of my first gigs in the arts was at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney as a gallery host, and there was this extraordinary wall weaving work by Ellen Utsui, which he makes these beautiful sort of woven structures out of liquor bottle caps, and they're stunning. They shimmer and they're totally beautiful. But I was invigilating this work over the series of months, and not less than 3 times I saw people sort of like sidle up to the work and then lick it. Like, that's absolutely what they wanted to do. I don't know why it was, like, but yeah, so it's just, it's interesting just thinking, I mean, yeah, that's perhaps a slightly odder example. I don't know if we could provide a...
There's many, many examples of people touching works. It's that thing where there's parts of a sculpture that end up super shiny because over and over people are touching that work. And even in that show where nobody touched the paintings, there was one artist, a friend of mine who's passed away now, Damien Bertoli, who said, "Oh no, I'm going to come back and touch them when no one is looking." So it's not that they're not wanting to touch. It's the sense of, well, I can't do this, so I better sidle up because there's Peter over there with a kind of, beady eye on me, but maybe I'll get away with it. And I think that there are works that activate that. But what's also interesting is that there are certain works that require that. For example, when I was working at SF MoMA, there were certain works in the conservation that they were made from soap, busts of soap, and there's only like a certain lifespan to the soap, and they were asking the artist, well, how do we know when it's gone off and we'll get another version? And he said, well, actually it's by licking it because it'll start fizzing. And so the conservators would be required to lick the soap sculpture to see whether it was still, in the collection or needing to be retired.
But there's so much spit involved in conservation. It's mostly how they clean paintings. I realise that we're not running out of time, but we're sort of heading towards a time. And I really did, in the context of a Writers Festival, want to dig into your project 3ply a little bit, which as sort of a radical, accessible online publishing platform. There's in particular that project was... I've forgotten the name of it, but it was percussion...
Tommy Carroll.
Yes.
I mean, 3ply hasn't been... It's sort of been like a separate arm of what I was doing because it's in some ways a carryover from what I was doing before. But this was an experiment that is actually accessible, and 3ply is shifting to be kind of more focused on this now. And this was, I was thinking about, well, how would you create a publication that's designed to be read by a screen reader? Because you mostly, when you use screen readers, you're always encountering these publications that are not designed that way. And so I asked Tommy, and it ends up being wonderful because it's like the screen reader will sound a little bit like this: 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 770, 70, 75, 75, 75. 7, 7, 70, 70, 70. So because he is a drummer, he played, and he's blind, and he played with the ways that the screen readers will create these percussive compositions. So I only made it available as a PDF that could be read by different screen readers for free download. But funnily enough, then I got contacted by a Parisian bookseller who's collected 3ply before that said, if you ever make a print version, we'll take them. So there's this demand for this, which I still haven't folded to make an exclusively print version of percussuation. But I thought, given that there's not that much time left, and there's so many great people here, some of whom I've recently met and some of whom I don't know, maybe what we could do is invite not just, conversation and response, but there's been images passing in the background. I've noticed some of them, most of them I haven't. I was wondering whether there's anybody who has seen something in the background and they could describe it to me, so it doesn't have to be the one that's up there, something that you've seen that you were interested in, and you could describe it to me, and then I could kind of share a little story about it. So, how does that sound? Yeah? I mean, maybe nobody's been interested in any images, and then this is going to fall flat, and then I could come up with a new idea. But we could try this, because it could be nice.
I have been mostly fixated on the talking and the touching objects that you've sent around, but there was an image that came up quite recently. There was a person wearing knee-high black boots and sort of stretched upwards, holding onto a sort of majestic bit of fabric coming down from a window maybe, or what else can I remember? Long hair, skin sort of like marble, but like, I guess, skin tone.
Yes, no, I know exactly what you're talking about. Great, there was a very useful description there. That is a crazy work. That is a 3-ply project. It's the idea, I was invited to be in the Tarawara Biennale, and it was a biennale that called Endless Circulation, so it was engaging with ideas of publishing. And I'm always sort of bringing like a kind of an ethics or a political edge to the things that I do. My background before I went into art very late was that I worked in peace building for the UN, so I kind of bring that with me. And I thought, look, this is kind of not fair that certain people get invited into these biennales and a whole lot of our community doesn't. How can I use publication as a way to invite more and more and more people, right? So first of all, I said, I approached Centre for Style, and I said, how about we collaborate on a magazine together, and the magazine will be our contribution to the show, and that will include in images from all sorts of other people that we reckon should be, seen at this level. And the Centre for Style said, yes, absolutely, but I'd also like to collaborate with Monica's Gallery. There was a collaborative duo, and they would like to build an installation form in the foyer, because we were going to have our publication in the foyer gallery bookstore. And I said, fantastic, fantastic. And then Monica's Gallery said, well, yes, but we would like to collaborate with Jessie Keeley so that they can make a clothing collection that responds to algorithms of fashion. And I said, fantastic, fantastic, let's do it. And so great, everybody, more and more and more people. And so we had the opening of the Tarawara Biennale. We had that installation infrastructure, and there was one window that I popped out of and read part of this magazine, and another window that Matthew Lindig popped out of and read it. There was a cellist who was in another window sort of playing this reverberating music all around the gallery, and then there were these sort of semi-naked models hiding up the top, and they would progressively come down the stairs, and then these clothes would fly over the structure and out the windows, and they would put them on and parade around the gallery. And it was really chaotic. It was almost a huge disaster, and it was wonderful. And so that's that image, yes. Well, that was good. That was good. Is there anybody else who saw an image that they might have been interested in from this? Oh, there's another one.
I was quite taken by the one that's set in nature, where there's quite a slender male figure with his hands in prayer position with a sarong leaning over some water.
Yeah, beautiful. So that is Benjamin Hancock again, and that is perhaps from our, I can't remember now if it was our second or third, we call it an issue of a performative publication. Sometimes it's called Essays in Vibrational Poetics, but that's also the umbrella title for a lot of things. The title, because I often use punctuation that's you can't pronounce, so the actual title is like a tilde. So I think it would be tilde, 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 and then something else would be the title for that one. And that was dealing with indecipherable language. So we were put together, Carla McFarlane at the Ian Potter Museum introduced us to a paleolinguist, I believe, who works on deciphering indecipherable languages, particularly Minoan Linear B. It's a really interesting story, but basically they were a group of people, and there's a number of different written forms that are associated with them. Cretan hieroglyphs, the first, Minoan Linear A, which has been deciphered, and Minoan Linear B, which hasn't. So there was a phrase that was on a votive ladle, and other pictures like from temples and things show these incredibly beautiful men with long hair and skinny waists and big kind of skirts carrying this to some sort of offering. And so we translated that script into embodied typography as part of one of these performances that we give. And one of the things that's so interesting about Minoan Linear B is we don't know what it says, but we know what it sounds like. And the reason we know what it sounds like is that the Greek, when they came in and they conquered Crete, they used the same written symbols to sound out Greek, and so you can actually understand the sound of the language even though you don't know what the original means. So that was that performance, and that was a series of photographs that we call typographic notes. It helps us remember what are the shapes that we bring into the performance, just in case at a future time somebody asks us to represent, or we call it reprint, the performance. So we save the key forms, and in this case we were referring to, there was a particular image in the script that was of, it was this sort of form and like little hands in prayer. And so to honour the source of the work, they were very engaged with nature, and we went back to nature and collaborated with the photographer to take these typographic notes outside.
I think we've got time for one more if there's a burning or smouldering question.
The three images that have just been on the screen with the wires crisscrossing across and the beautiful cloth, and this one that's up at the moment with someone sleeping in it. I'd love to hear more about those.
So I did a series of works with Sophie Takash, who is a sculptor who thinks really deeply about material forces. And we did show at Gertrude Glasshouse using rawhides. And the reason we were using rawhides is because that used to be a tannery, and she got them from, I think it was like a surplus from a drum maker or something. There was some sort of, sustainability ethos to this. But the reason for the rawhides originally was the tannery. But in using those rawhide forms, what I learnt from Sophie was that when they're wet, they're like seaweed. They're totally malleable, but then they dry, and they dry hard. And so we were able to use this in one of the shows, because in that first show I was collaborating with Troy McConnell, who has multiple disability, and I had been invited to work by scope with an artist who was blind. But when Troy turned up to collaborate with me, and I'd planned a whole sort of tactile engagement and audio description performance, I met Troy and discovered that he uses a wheelchair, that he has one movement he can make, which is to unclench, and that he does have some speech. So together we talked about, well, how could we start this making process? And he dropped the bronzes into the rawhide, and it deformed them, and by the time it dried, it had perfect casts of these forms. So then Sophie and I thought about how could we scale this up, and so at Casula Powerhouse, which is out of Sydney, is incredible space with high ceilings, and Sophie came up with the idea for these sort of steel forms that would hold these rawhides, and that the sculptures would be responsive and tactile once they were cast. But the question was, what are we going to cast? What's the activation? And so I invited back Janaline Wolfe and Ben Phillips, who had been the two actors that I started with that very first show, and I said, how about you come along to Casula outside of hours, play within these forms and these galleries, do whatever you want to them, and then we'll open the show the next day. And so it was brilliant, because there were also rock paintings that I had made, and Janaline was rubbing her nose all over them and saying the best way to feel a painting is, to touch a painting is with your nose. And she got really excited about the rawhide forms. It was flapping them up in the air and whooping, because it's, a huge cavern, and created this incredible sound. And then she made me get under. It was so horrible. It was all clammy and wet, and made me get under and be like ghosts or something. And we made these audio descriptions of this. So there's 3 tracks actually that are from that night. And for me, they are the audio description of the making of that show. But whereas Janaline was so full of life, Ben Phillips wanted to be quiet. And when he touched the rock paintings, I remember he began to cry because they reminded him of his grandfather. And he said, I want to be with the work alone. And he climbed into one of those rawhide forms. And he wasn't asleep, but he was so still and so immersed. And the ways that he touched them gently and tentatively, it's just a beautiful experience of an artwork that's really difficult to have when you've got a bunch of spectators around you. And it was that experience that also shifted my mind from thinking, oh, we want to do everything public, to going, actually, we need to preserve some private moments where it's not about spectatorship of the blind, because that turns into something else, but it's about inviting people with blindness, who are my collaborators, to come and really immerse in and engage with the art as a way of being the beginning process to invite others.
Beautiful. Thank you. It has been such a delight to stumble with you for the last hour or so.
And we didn't have any of our prepared notes. I had all of those quotes in case we needed them.
I would love to just extend a huge thanks for everyone coming today. It's been a really beautiful session.
Thanks for listening to this special bonus episode of Conversations from the Collection. Be sure to subscribe now so you don't miss out when our next season launches on January 10. Conversations from the Collection is a Newcastle Art Gallery production, and we pay our deepest respects to the traditional custodians of the lands on which this podcast was produced. This project is supported by the New South Wales Government through Create New South Wales, and if you enjoyed listening, why not share us with a friend? Until next time.